The sea that birthed monsters had 1,000 voices. Alec MacLeod had learned this in the Royal Navy, where the shriek of the wind through rigging and the groan of a bulkhead under pressure could sound like a dying man's last words. But the sea was just water and wind, physics and force. It had no malice, it simply was. He clung to that truth like a handrail in a gale as the time's Hesperus times cut through the slate-gray waters of the outer Hebrides. Before him, piercing the low December clouds, was the pale spike of the Flannan Isles lighthouse on Eilean Moor, the light of the Seven Hunters. A new tower, a monument to engineering and resolve, standing silent when it should be a beacon. Alec was a man of logic, an investigator for the Northern Lighthouse Board. His tools were calipers, logbooks, and a methodical mind that dismantled problems into their component parts. Superstition was rust on the gears of reason. Yet, in the pocket of his oilskin coat, a scrap of paper burned with a cold, irrational fire. It was a torn page from the lighthouse log, pressed into his hand days ago in an Oban pub by a terrified clerk from the board. It wasn't in the familiar, neat script of his estranged brother, Thomas, one of the 3 missing keepers. The hand was panicked, spidery. Asterisk, December 13th. The storm is not of this world. It screams with a second voice. The stone itself trembles. James is silent. God help us. Asterisk. The official weather reports for that date showed nothing more than a stiff breeze. A grim sight, Mr. MacLeod, a calm voice said beside him. Alec turned. Mr. Finch was a stark contradiction to the wild scene around them. Dressed in a fine wool coat that seemed to repel the sea spray, his face was a pale, emotionless mask. He was supposedly an observer from the Admiralty, interested in the structural integrity of these new towers. Alec didn't buy it for a second. Finch's eyes were too watchful, his presence too calculated. Lighthouses are often grim, Mr. Finch, Alec replied, his gaze returning to the island. It's their nature. They exist because the world is dangerous. Indeed, Finch offered a thin smile. And men, too, dangerous creatures. From the wheelhouse, the captain of the Times, Hesperus, asterisk, a barrel-chested seaman named Weir, shouted against the wind. No flag, Mr. MacLeod, and the landing is a mess. Looks like a storm tore the supply crate to splinters. Alec nodded, his eyes scanning the cliffs. A storm. The official narrative was already being cemented. A rogue wave, a tragic accident. Simple, clean. But the words on the paper screamed otherwise. Asterisk. A second voice. Asterisk. The landing on Eilean Moor was a brutal, chaotic affair. The longboat pitched and yawed in the swell, threatening to smash against the jagged black rocks of the landing stage. Once ashore, an unnatural quiet descended. The cacophony of the gulls that should have filled the air was absent. There was only the endless roar of the Atlantic and the sighing of the wind across the coarse grass. The lighthouse loomed over them, a 150-foot tower of granite that felt less like a savior and more like a tombstone. The heavy entrance door was unlocked. Wait here, Alec commanded the landing party. Secure the gear. I'll go first. Finch stepped forward. I'll accompany you, Mr. MacLeod. Admiralty regulations. Alec gave a curt nod. He didn't want the man's company, but arguing was a waste of breath. Inside, the air was cold and still. A layer of damp clung to everything. The first thing Alec noted was the clock on the wall. Its pendulum was still. The time was 9:30. The second was the table in the small kitchen and living area. It was set for a meal that had never been eaten. A plate of salted mutton, cold and congealed. An overturned chair, as if its occupant had risen in a sudden, violent hurry. Looks like they left in a panic, Finch observed, his voice betraying no emotion. "Or were taken in one," Alec murmured, his mind working. He moved through the small space, his senses on high alert. No sign of a struggle, no blood. The men's oilskins were gone, suggesting they had prepared to go outside. But their foul-weather boots were still lined up by the door. Who would go out into a Hebridean storm in their house slippers? He ascended the winding stone staircase, Finch's polished shoes clicking behind him. In the keeper's sleeping quarters, the beds were made. Everything was tidy, unnervingly so. This was his brother's domain. Thomas, for all his faults, was a man of meticulous habit. Alec ran a hand over the rough wool blanket on one of the bunks. He felt a pang, not of sorrow, but of a deep, aching frustration. Their last conversation, 5 years ago, had been a torrent of bitter accusations over their father's death, ending with Thomas turning his back on him for good. Alec had come here not to save a brother he'd lost long ago, but to reclaim a piece of a puzzle he felt was owed to him. He was owed an answer. On Thomas's small writing desk, he found the main logbook. He flipped it open. The last entry was for December 12th, detailing high winds and the extinguishing of the lamp for maintenance. It was in Thomas's hand. The following pages were blank. The torn page in his pocket was the only record of what happened next. "Find anything, MacLeod?" Finch's voice was a scalpel, cutting through his thoughts. "The official log is missing entries after the 12th, Alec said, snapping the book shut. "My brother was nothing if not diligent." As they descended, a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated up through the soles of his boots. He paused, placing his hand on the cold stone wall. It was faint, like a distant engine. "What is it?" Finch asked. "Do you feel that?" Finch stood perfectly still. "I feel nothing but the cold, Mr. MacLeod. Perhaps the sea is playing tricks on you." Alec's eyes narrowed. Finch was lying. He was sure of it. Back, outside, Captain Weir met them. "Anything?" "3 men vanished into thin air, Captain. Their last meal uneaten, their clocks stopped. The place is clean as a whistle." "A wave," Weir said, his voice gruff. "It happens. A freak wave can do strange things. I've seen it snatch men from a deck and leave their teacup untouched." "Perhaps," Alec said, his gaze drifting to the base of the tower. He saw something Weir and Finch had missed. Deep gouges in the granite blocks near the foundation, as if something of immense weight and sharpness had clawed at the stone. They were fresh. "Captain, I need 2 of your men to help me inspect the lower levels. The foundation, the storage cellars." Weir shifted his weight, avoiding Alec's eye. "I can't spare them, MacLeod. The weather's turning. I need every hand to secure the landing gear before the tide comes in. Finch's orders." Finch gave a slight apologetic shrug. "Safety first." It was a lie. The sky was overcast but stable. The sea was rough but manageable. They were stonewalling him, misdirecting him, keeping him away from the tower's base. That night, sleep offered no escape. Alec lay in his bunk on the Times Hesperus Asterisk, the ship rocking uneasily in the lee of the island. He dreamt of his father's fishing boat, of the splintering wood and the scream of the wind turning into his brother's voice, accusing him. He awoke in a cold sweat, the low hum from the island seeming to echo in the very bones of the ship. He wouldn't be deterred. Before dawn, armed with a lantern and a set of lighthouse blueprints he'd brought from the board, he rowed the small dinghy back to the island alone. The hum was stronger now, a resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. Logic dictated it was a machine. His blueprints showed the standard layout: lamp room, quarters, oil store, and a small cellar for dry goods. There was no engine room, no generator. The lamp was paraffin-fueled. Inside, the lighthouse. The silence was deeper, more menacing than before. He made his way to the cellar. It was a small, brick-lined room filled with barrels and crates. The air was frigid. He ran his hand along the far wall, the one facing the sea. The blueprints showed it as solid bedrock, but as he tapped along the mortar lines, he heard it, a hollow echo. Using the pry bar from his kit, he worked at the bricks. They were newer than the rest, the mortar still pale. Behind them was not rock, but a sheet of riveted iron, a hidden door. It took all his strength, but he managed to wrench it open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into absolute blackness. The air that rose to meet him was charged with ozone and the smell of hot metal. The hum was a palpable force now, a physical presence that vibrated in his teeth. He descended, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the walls of a perfectly circular chamber carved from the bedrock. In the center of the room stood the source of the noise. It was a nightmarish contraption of brass coils, thick glass vacuum tubes glowing with a sickly blue light, and a central crystal the size of a man's skull that pulsed with the rhythmic hum. Wires snaked from it into the very foundations of the lighthouse. It was unlike any technology Alec had ever seen. Impressive, isn't it? Alec spun around. Finch stood at the top of the stairs, a Webley revolver in his hand. Behind him stood Captain Weir and two sailors, also armed. The false ally. The twist of the knife. "What is this, Finch?" Alec demanded, his own hand inching towards the marlinspike on his belt. "This, Mr. McLeod, is the future of naval warfare," Finch said, descending the stairs with a predator's grace. "An acoustic resonance device, Project Siren. It's capable of mapping the seabed with unparalleled accuracy. Finding channels, mapping trenches, locating enemy submarines before they're even built. And the keepers?" Finch's expression was one of mild annoyance. "Unfortunate but necessary collateral. We needed a remote, stable platform for the prototype. The keepers were told it was a new type of foghorn sensor. When it began to malfunction, I imagine the effects were disorienting." A whisper slithered through the chamber, coiling around the hum of the machine. It sounded like Thomas. "Asterisk Alec. Why did you leave him?" Asterisk Alec flinched. "What was that?" "Auditory hallucinations," Finch said dismissively. "A side effect of the device's resonance frequency. It plays havoc with the inner ear, the brain." The keepers likely thought a phantom storm was raging outside. They probably heard voices. It seems to have driven them mad. They ran out into the night, and the sea did the rest. Weir looked uneasy. "Finch, the real storm is coming. We need to get the core and get out of here." As if on cue, a deep boom echoed from above, followed by the shriek of wind. The entire tower shuddered. The real storm had arrived. The blue light from the device flared, and the hum pitched upward into a painful, keening whine. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking in Gaelic, in Norse, in languages long dead. They spoke of the deep places, of the crushing dark, and of something that slept there. Asterisk. The storm is not of this world. Asterisk. The logbook entry slammed into Alec's mind. It wasn't a metaphor. The device hadn't just mapped the ocean floor. It had knocked on a door, and something had answered. Asterisk. It screams with a second voice. Asterisk. A new sound joined the storm, and the machine a piercing, sonar-like shriek that resonated not in the ears, but in the skull. One of the sailors screamed, clutching his head, his eyes wide with terror. "I see it! In the water!" The stone floor beneath them grew slick with seawater, seeping up through invisible cracks in the bedrock. The air shimmered in a corner of the room, distorting like a heat haze. The formless shape condensed, tightened. "What is that?" Weir stammered, raising his rifle. "A projection! A trick of the light and sound!" Finch snapped, but his voice was tight with the first flicker of fear. The shimmering distortion lashed out. It wasn't a tentacle, not a claw, but a focused wave of kinetic force. It struck the screaming sailor, and he didn't just fall, he imploded. His body crushed inward by an unimaginable pressure, his rifle clattering to the floor. Panic erupted. The other sailor fired his rifle wildly into the shimmering air. The bullets passed through it, as if it were smoke. The entity, this time Cedra Finn Times from Forgotten Myths, was not entirely physical. It was a creature of pressure and sound. The Times Caller of the Tides asterisk. Another wave of force slammed into the wall, cracking the ancient stone. Water poured into the chamber, cold and black. The lights on the device flickered wildly. "Turn it off, Finch!" Alec yelled over the cacophony. "I can't! The storm is feeding it!" Finch yelled back, fumbling with a control panel on the machine. "It's created a feedback loop." The creature's shriek intensified, and with it came a voice, clear as a bell, mimicking James Ducat, the principal keeper. "The door! Open the door! Let me in!" It was luring them, playing with them. Weir, his face a mask of terror, broke. He turned and scrambled for the stairs. He never made it. The shimmering presence flowed over him like water, and his screams were abruptly silenced. There was just a wet, crushing sound. Now it was just Alec and Finch, trapped in the flooding chamber with a hungry ghost made of physics. Finch, in a desperate, last-ditch effort, tried to pull the crystal core from its housing. "Don't!" Alec shouted, his mind racing. He was a sailor, an engineer. He knew machinery. He knew demolition. You don't fight a sound, you silence it. The entity's call focused on Finch. It whispered his ambitions, his secrets, his fears. The cold, calculating. The man from the Admiralty began to weep, clawing at his own face as the auditory assault broke him. The shimmering haze enveloped him, and his pleas for mercy were cut short. Alec was alone. The water was up to his waist, icy and pulling at him. The machine was the lure. He had to destroy it. He saw the main power conduit, a thick oilcloth-wrapped cable running from the device to a junction box on the wall. Using the pry bar, he waded through the surging water and wrenched the box open. Sparks flew, illuminating the churning chaos. With his marlin spike, he began to sever the secondary cables, isolating the main feed. The creature shrieked, a sound of fury and pain, as if he were cutting its own nerves. A wave of force threw him against the far wall, and his head cracked against the stone. Black spots danced in his vision. He fought his way back, gasping for air. He had one last chance. He took the heavy steel pry bar and jammed it across the main terminals inside the junction box, creating a dead short. The result was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A blinding flash of blue-white light. A deafening crack of thunder that dwarfed the storm outside. The device exploded, sending a shower of shattered crystal and molten brass across the chamber. And then, silence. The supernatural shriek was gone. The whispers were gone. The only sounds were the howling of the wind and the gurgle of the sea pouring into the ruined chamber. The creature's focal point was destroyed. Its coal silenced. It had receded, drawn back into the abyssal depths from which it came. Alec hauled his battered body out of the rising water and up the stairs, sealing the iron door behind him. He stumbled up the main lighthouse staircase, the storm raging outside, shaking the granite tower to its core. He didn't stop until he reached the lamp room at the very top. He collapsed against the thick glass, watching the titanic waves crash against the island, sending spray hundreds of feet into the air. He was the sole survivor. He had the truth, a truth so monstrous no one would ever believe it. The Admiralty would bury Finch's involvement. The Northern Lighthouse Board would declare it a tragic accident. The mystery of the Flannan Isles would become a ghost story, a mariner's legend whispered for 100 years. As dawn finally broke, the storm began to recede. its fury spent. The gray light crept over a bruised and battered sea. Alec MacLeod stood alone in the silent lighthouse, a keeper of a terrible secret. He had come seeking an answer owed to him by his brother. He had found it, not in a logbook or a last confession, but in the shriek of a thing from the deep. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any Atlantic gale, that he would be haunted by that silence for the rest of his days.